Okay, so we've sort of been heading here all quarter, and finally we arrive at the cerebral cortex. So we talked about the diencephalon, which is sort of nestled inside the cerebral cortex, and now we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex itself. So the learning objectives for this portion are, I want you to be able to define some disorders and name a lesion location for each of the disorders. So a lesion in a different location will cause a different type of disorder. Hopefully that makes sense, and we'll talk about it more. So the different disorders that we're going to talk about in this section are agnosia, which means the inability to know, if you want to think of it that way. Astereognosis, which we talked about stereognosis, and astereognosis is you can't do it. Visual agnosia is the inability to process visual information, basically. Auditory agnosia is the inability to process auditory information. Apraxia is a motor planning disorder. Dysarthria is a speech disorder. And motor perseveration is repeating the same motion over and over and over again. And we'll talk about all of those. I want you to be able to describe the location, the function, and disorders of the primary and secondary sensory areas of the cortex, as well as the location, function, and disorders of the motor planning areas of the cortex. So we'll talk about each one of those areas individually and all of those disorders. So the cerebral cortex is this big, convoluted sheet of cell bodies, axons, and dendrites covering the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. So usually when we talk about the cortex of something, it's like the outer layer of it. So it's the outer layer of the brain, and it's just it contains lots of different layers that are differentiated by size and connectivity of the different cells. So I don't expect you to memorize the layers of the cerebral cortex, but I just want you to appreciate the complexity of the cerebral cortex in all its different layers. So in the olfactory and medial temporal cortex, there are 3 layers of cells. But in all of the rest of the cerebral cortex, there are 6 layers of cells. And they're all kind of doing their different processing functions, which is amazing, really. So before all the fancy imaging that we have now, like those cool T1 images and MRIs and everything, they used to have to map areas of the cerebral cortex by doing surgeries. So they would, people who were undergoing brain surgery, to remove a tumor or something like that, in the past have allowed neurosurgeons to stimulate and record from various areas of the cerebral cortex. Now we can use imaging techniques to do that, so we don't need invasive procedures, but this map that's pictured here and several like it were developed by a neurosurgeon named Brodmann, and they're called Brodmann's areas. And it was sort of the first glimpse of what we know of the different areas of the cerebral cortex. Now we can do a lot with functional MRI and a lot of other things, so we're learning more and more. But Brodmann's areas are sort of how we initially found out about these things. So there are 5 categories of localized functions of the cerebral cortex. There's the primary sensory cortex, which discriminates among different intensities and qualities of sensory information. There's the primary motor cortex, which provides descending control of motor output. There's the secondary sensory cortex, which performs a more complex analysis of sensation, and we'll talk more about that. There are motor planning areas, which organize movements. And then there are areas that we call association cortex, which controls behavior, interprets sensation, and processes emotions and memories. So I don't know if you ever heard when you were a kid or in the past where people would say, oh, well, you only use a small percentage of your brain. That's actually not true. But there's only a small percentage of our brain that is dedicated to particular functions, and the rest of it is all association cortex, which is really important for controlling and processing and interpreting all of these different inputs that are coming into our brain. So the association area makes up a huge percentage of the cerebral cortex, of the association cortex, and then those individual other areas do specific things. So here's sort of the layout of how things happen in those different areas. So in the primary sensory cortex, you get that simple sensory discrimination, intensity and quality of sensation. And then that information gets processed, it gets handed off to a secondary sensory cortex, which then recognizes that sensation and says, I think I know what that is. I'm going to compare this with my memories and with my past things and look at my emotions and integrate this all and figure out what it is. Once the sensation is recognized by the secondary sensory cortex, then it goes to the association cortex, where we select goals, we plan, we monitor, we interpret that sensation. What are we going to do with it? We process emotions and memory, and the output of that might go to the motor planning areas, where we're then going to compose and sequence movement. And once it goes from the that's done in the motor planning areas, it gets passed to the primary motor cortex, which sends cortical motor output to the spinal cord, so it can get to those lower motor neurons and cause movement. So it's a pretty complex process, but each area of the cortex has its job in doing that. So that's why we call it localized functions, because they are pretty localized within those individual areas. So the primary sensory cortex, each primary sensory area discriminates among different intensities and qualities of one type of input. So we have a visual area, we have an auditory area, we have areas for different types of sensation. So most primary sensory areas are located within and adjacent to landmark cortical fissures. So the primary visual cortex is within the calcarine sulcus and adjacent gyri in the occipital lobe. The primary vestibular cortex is at the posterior end of the lateral fissure in the parietal insular cortex. And the primary somatosensory cortex is just posterior to the central sulcus of the brain in the anterior part of the parietal lobe. So this is a depiction from the book of those individual cortices. So the area that we consider to be the primary somatosensory cortex, and when we were talking about the somatosensory system, we talked about the somatosensory homunculus, which is the map of the brain to what areas of the body are sensed in that individual brain area. So the somatosensory cortex, that's where that somatosensory homunculus lives, in that part of the cortex. And then the visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, and the vestibular is in that tiny little part in the parietal temporal area. So I like this chart in the book because it lays this out really easily, and there's another chart very similar to this in the module, and it tells you what the function of each area is and what the causes of a lesion are. So if you have a lesion in the primary somatosensory area, you're going to lose tactile localization, and you're going to lose conscious proprioception. If you have a lesion in the primary auditory area, you're going to lose localization of sounds. If you have a lesion in the primary visual area, you're going to end up with homonymous hemianopia, because you're going to lose part of your visual field. And if you have a lesion in the primary vestibular cortex, you're going to have a change in the awareness of head position and movement and the perception of your idea of what's vertical. So all of those different areas have an individual function, and a lesion causes interruption of that individual function. It makes sense, right? So when we lose discriminative sensory information because of a lesion in the primary sensory area, it impairs the ability to discriminate the intensity and quality of stimuli. So it really severely interferes with our capacity to use the sensations that are coming in from the periphery. A unilateral lesion in the primary auditory cortex only interferes with the ability to localize sound. You can still hear and you can still process some of that information, but you can't tell where the sound is coming from. Primary visual cortex lesions cause contralateral homonymous hemianopia. So it affects that part of the visual field. The perception really is the interpretation of sensation into meaningful forms. Perception is an active process, and it requires interaction between the brain, the body, and the environment. So a perception also involves memory of past experiences, motivation, expectations, the selection of sensory information, and the active search for pertinent sensory information. So a lot of things can affect our perception. The secondary sensory areas are analyzing sensory input both from the thalamus and from the primary sensory cortex. So there are different areas in the secondary sensory areas that contribute to the analysis of one type of sensory information. So neurons in the secondary somatosensory area provide stereognosis by comparing that raw sensation, that somatosensation, from the current object with memories from other objects. So we talked about that. You're reaching around in your bag, you're looking for your keys. It's comparing what you are currently feeling to memories of what a key is, what a key feels like. So the secondary sensory areas, if you have a lesion in that secondary sensory area, it can cause astereognosis, so the inability to recognize things by touch. So this is our little map of the secondary sensory areas. So again, we have secondary somatosensory, secondary visual, secondary auditory. So secondary somatosensory, it provides stereognosis and memory of tactile and spatial environment. And a lesion causes astereognosis. Secondary visual, it's analysis of motion, color, recognition of visual objects, understanding of visual spatial relationships, and control of visual fixation. So if we have a lesion in our secondary visual area, that results in visual agnosia or optic ataxia. So visual agnosia is your inability to know what you're seeing. Basically, you can think of it that way. Auditory agnosia is the inability to know what you're hearing. So the secondary auditory cortex, it classifies sounds. It's like, is that noise? Is it music? Is it someone's voice? Is it a cat meowing? It processes all that, compares it with your memories, and it allows you to know what the sound is. The primary cortex tells you where the sound is coming from, and the secondary cortex tells you what it is. So if you have a lesion in the secondary auditory cortex, you're not going to know what a sound is, and that's auditory agnosia. So all lesions affecting secondary sensory areas are called agnosia, and it's the general term for the inability to recognize objects when using a specific sense. So the subtypes of agnosia are astereognosis, visual agnosia, and auditory agnosia. So those are all, and agnosia, you can think of it as it's the inability to know, inability to recognize objects. Even though your peripheral senses are intact, that part of your brain can't recognize the information that is coming into it. So astereognosis, it's the inability to identify objects by touch and manipulation despite intact discriminative somatosensation. So the periphery is okay, but the part of the brain that analyzes that is the problem. A person with astereognosis would be able to describe an object being palpated, but not by touching or manipulating it. So they might be able to say, oh, describe what it looks like, describe different things about it. They could say, oh, one side feels pointy, but they wouldn't be able to integrate that information and know what it is without looking at it. Visual agnosia is the inability to visually recognize objects despite having intact vision. So a person with visual agnosia can describe the size and shape of an object using vision, but it can't identify that object. So there is a really highly specific type of visual agnosia, and it's called prosopagnosia. And it usually is associated with bilateral damage to the inferior secondary visual areas. And so you can't recognize specific things, which is really interesting. So there's a certain part of your brain that is dedicated to recognizing your car or your child or your husband. And that particular type of visual agnosia means you look at your husband and you don't know who he is, which is really strange, but a very specific type of visual agnosia. Auditory agnosia is caused by the destruction of the secondary auditory cortex. You can still perceive sound, but you can't recognize what it is. So if you get destruction of the right auditory cortex, it interferes with interpretation of environmental sounds, of what's going on around you. So a lot of the things on our right sensory cortex has to do with spatial analysis and what's going on around you in the environment. And so when you have the right auditory cortex, you can't figure out what's going on around you by sound. Next section, we're going to talk about the motor cortices.